They said the number out loud like it was proof of success. $153,000. That was the figure repeated again and again in comment sections, live streams, reaction videos, and thumbnails. $153,000 raised for the Whittaker family. To the outside world, it sounded like a miracle, like a problem solved, like a happy ending already written. But inside the Whittaker world, nothing felt solved at all. Betty sat at her kitchen table, the same one she'd eaten at for decades, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The number didn't mean much to her. It wasn't sitting in her bank account. It wasn't paying the electric bill. It wasn't bringing her family back together. All she knew was that everything around her felt smaller, quieter, and more broken than it had before the money ever came into the picture. "I don't understand where it went," she said softly, not accusing, not angry, just tired. "They keep saying all that money was raised, but I don't see nothing changed for us." BJ stood nearby, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. She'd heard the same thing repeated online so many times it echoed in her sleep. People said the Whittakers were ungrateful, that they were irresponsible, that they blew the money. But no one ever asked the simplest question. If $153,000 was raised, why did the family still live the same way? Why were they still struggling? Why were they more divided than ever? Larry said it bluntly. You can't lose what you never had. And that was the part most people didn't want to hear. When the fundraiser started, it came wrapped in hope and urgency. Videos showed the family living the way they always had. The porch, the worn furniture, the routines people didn't understand. Viewers felt shock, sympathy, curiosity. And many felt a sudden need to fix it. Money poured in faster than anyone expected. Donations came from people who would never set foot in Odd, West Virginia, but felt connected through a screen. At first, Betty believed it would help. Not in some grand way. She didn't dream of mansions or new cars. She thought maybe the roof could be fixed. Maybe the house could be made warmer. Maybe they could stop worrying so much about what would break next. But the money never arrived the way people assumed it would. It didn't show up as a check with her name on it. It didn't come with a plan explained in plain language. Instead, it existed somewhere else. Managed by others. Discussed in meetings she wasn't part of. Justified with explanations that sounded official but felt distant. "They tell me it's being handled," Betty said. "But I don't know what that means." What it meant, slowly and painfully, was that the money became a wedge instead of a bridge. People argued over control, over responsibility, over who knew better. Every decision was debated online by strangers who believed donating gave them a vote. Some demanded receipts. Others demanded silence. The family was no longer just a family. They were a project, a controversy. BJ saw the shift before most people did. She noticed how conversations changed tone, how help came with conditions, how kindness started to feel transactional. "They don't ask us what we need," she said. "They tell us what they think we should have." And what they thought the family should have didn't always align with reality. There were rules no one explained clearly. Welfare limits, asset thresholds, consequences no one wanted to talk about because they complicated the feel-good story. Money raised publicly doesn't automatically equal money that can be safely used. Especially not for a family dependent on assistance to survive. Every dollar mattered in ways outsiders didn't understand. Accept too much and benefits disappear. Lose benefits and suddenly there's no health care. No food assistance. No safety net. The very thing meant to help could push them closer to collapse. "People think money fixes everything," Larry said. "But sometimes it just makes things worse." As the weeks passed, the online narrative grew louder while the family grew quieter. Accusations flew. Screenshots circulated. Live streams broke down who said what and when. Meanwhile, Betty worried about simpler things. Whether Ray was eating enough. Whether Lorraine was safe. Whether Timmy was okay wherever he was that night. The house felt emptier. The porch quieter. The silence heavier. "They say we lost everything," Betty said one evening. "But it feels like we started losing it when everybody started paying attention." The $153,000 became a symbol instead of a solution. Proof, people said, that help had been given. Proof that the family should be set. Proof that any continued struggle must be their own fault. But proof doesn't keep families together. What no one wanted to admit was that the money didn't protect them. It didn't shield them from scrutiny. It didn't stop agencies from stepping in. It didn't prevent separation. If anything, it accelerated everything. Once the story went viral, everything changed. People showed up with cameras. With opinions. With plans. Some meant well. Others wanted content. But all of them brought pressure. And pressure cracks fragile systems. The family didn't just lose stability. They lost privacy. They lost trust in outsiders. They lost control over their own narrative. BJ said it plainly. Before the money, we were poor. After the money, we were powerless. Betty nodded when she heard that. She understood it in her bones. "They talk about numbers," she said. "But they don't talk about what it cost us." What it cost them was peace. Arguments that never existed before became daily. People questioned motives. Loyalties fractured. Relationships strained under the weight of outside voices whispering different advice into different ears. "Everybody thinks they know what's best," Larry said. "But nobody has to live with the consequences except us." And then came the final blow. The one no amount of money could undo. The family was separated. Suddenly, the house that once held them all felt like a reminder of what was gone. The money couldn't stop it. Couldn't reverse it. Couldn't explain it away. People online asked, how could this happen after $153,000 was raised? The answer was simple but uncomfortable. Because money doesn't replace understanding. Because charity without structure can become chaos. Because attention can be as dangerous as neglect. And because the Whittakers were never asking to be saved. They were asking to be respected. Betty said it best, staring at the same walls she'd stared at for years. "We didn't need a miracle. We needed someone to listen." The money came. The cameras came. The noise came. And somehow, in the middle of all of it, the family lost everything that mattered most. If you followed this story, share your thoughts below. Do you think money helps or hurts when it comes without understanding? Leave a comment and let's talk about it. The moment the family was separated, the meaning of that $153,000 shifted forever. It stopped being a symbol of generosity and became a question that refused to go away. Where did it go? Who controlled it? And why did everything seem worse instead of better? For people watching from the outside, the separation felt sudden, shocking, unjust. But for the Whittakers, it felt like the slow result of months of pressure building behind the scenes. Pressure from agencies. Pressure from strangers. Pressure from expectations they never agreed to carry. Betty remembered the day things truly started to change. It wasn't when the donations surged. It wasn't when the videos went viral. It was when decisions started being made without her. "They stopped asking me," she said quietly. "They just told me what was going to happen." Plans were discussed in private calls she wasn't on. Documents were mentioned she never saw. Meetings happened where her life was the topic, but her voice wasn't present. The money created a power shift, and she felt it immediately. BJ felt it too. She'd always been outspoken, always protective. And as the money grew, so did the tension between what the family wanted and what outsiders thought was best. "They talked like we were children," BJ said. Like we didn't understand our own lives. The narrative online began to harden. Comment sections filled with certainty. People spoke with authority about things they'd never experienced. Welfare rules. Mental capacity. Family dynamics. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a judgment. Few had facts. Larry watched it all with growing frustration. He'd worked most of his life. He understood systems better than people gave him credit for. And he knew exactly how fragile the family situation had become. Once the money showed up, he said, everything we did started being watched. Every purchase was questioned. Every decision dissected. Every mistake magnified. The family wasn't allowed to simply exist anymore. They had to perform responsibility to satisfy donors who believed their contribution entitled them to oversight. And then came the agencies. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. It started with visits. Chickens. Questions framed as concern. But concern can quickly turn into control when the environment is already unstable. They asked about money, Betty recalled. Not like they were curious. Like they were worried. Worried about where it came from. Who had access. Whether it was being used properly. Whether it changed the household dynamics. Whether it affected eligibility for assistance. No one explained things clearly. No one sat down and said, here's what this means. Here's the risk. Here's how we protect you. Instead, the family felt like they were being evaluated against rules they never agreed to play by. The irony was painful. The money meant to help was now being used as evidence that something was wrong. BJ saw it immediately. They started acting like we were dangerous because people gave us money. Dangerous. Unstable. At risk. Words that carried weight far beyond the internet. The separation didn't happen because of one incident. It happened because of accumulation. Too many eyes. Too many opinions. Too much pressure layered on a family that had survived for decades by staying under the radar. And suddenly, the radar was everywhere. Ray struggled the most. The routines that kept him calm were disrupted. The familiar faces replaced by new ones. The noise replaced by silence. Betty worried constantly. I don't sleep, she admitted. I lay there wondering if he's okay. Lorraine withdrew. Timmy grew confused and angry. Each of them processed the chaos differently, but all of them felt the loss. They say it's for our own good, Larry said bitterly. But nobody asked us what good looks like. Online, the arguments intensified. Some insisted the separation proved the family was unsafe all along. Others claimed it was proof of systemic failure. The money became the centerpiece of every argument. If $153,000 was raised, why wasn't the house fixed? Why didn't they move? Why didn't they get professionals involved? Questions asked loudly, without context, without patience. What most people didn't understand was that money doesn't automatically unlock solutions, especially not when it's tied to strings, expectations, and legal consequences. BJ tried to explain this more than once. You can't just drop money into a situation like this and expect it to work. But nuance doesn't travel well online. The family felt blamed for not performing gratitude correctly, for not transforming fast enough, for not matching the imagined outcome donors had pictured when they clicked send. They wanted a makeover story, BJ said, not real life. And real life is messy, especially when layered with disability, poverty, and sudden exposure. Betty felt the judgment most acutely. She'd spent her life caring for others. Suddenly, people questioned her capacity to do so. They talk like I don't love my family, she said, voice cracking. That hurts more than anything. The money couldn't protect her from that pain. If anything, it amplified it. As weeks passed, the funds became a source of suspicion rather than relief. People demanded updates. Demanded proof. demanded explanations. Meanwhile, Betty just wanted her family back. "They can keep the money," she said once. "I just want my people." That sentence never made it into headlines. It wasn't dramatic enough. It didn't fit the outrage cycle. But it was the truth. Larry noticed how quickly supporters disappeared once the story got complicated. Donations slowed. Comments thinned. The crowd moved on to the next controversy. "What happens when the cameras leave?" he asked. "We still hear." The separation remained. The questions remained. The money remained somewhere else. And the family was left to live with the consequences of a story that grew bigger than them. BJ said it best during a quiet moment, sitting on the porch where so much of their life had unfolded. "They didn't steal our money," she said. "They stole our peace." The $153,000 didn't save the Whittakers. It didn't protect them. It didn't even belong to them in the way people assumed. What it did was change everything. And not for the better. If you're still following this story, take a moment to reflect on what real help looks like. Is it money alone, or is it understanding, patience, and respect? Share your thoughts below and keep the conversation going. By the time people began asking the hardest questions, the Whittaker family had already lost the most important thing they had: control over their own story. Part 3 of this story isn't about where the money went in a technical sense. It's about what happens when a family becomes a symbol instead of people, when charity turns into surveillance, and when help arrives without consent. After the separation, the family entered a kind of limbo. There were no clear answers, only reassurances that sounded hollow the longer they waited. They kept saying, "Temporary," Betty recalled. But nobody could tell me how long temporary was. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks into months. And with each passing stretch of time, the distance between what the family had been promised and what they were living grew wider. The money was always there in the background. Not physically. Not accessible. But present in every conversation, every decision, every justification. Officials asked about it. Commenters demanded explanations about it. Content creators speculated endlessly about it. But the family couldn't touch it. That was the cruelest irony. Larry tried repeatedly to clarify the situation with agencies. He asked direct questions. Does the money mean we don't qualify anymore? Does it mean we're considered stable? Does it mean we're unsafe? The answers were vague. Non-committal. Carefully worded. "It depends," they said. "We're still assessing," they said. "There are multiple factors," they said. Meanwhile, life went on without the people who made it feel like life. Ray struggled to adjust to new routines imposed by strangers. Lorraine stopped asking when she could go home. Timmy became increasingly withdrawn. "They stopped hoping," Betty said quietly. "That's when I knew it was bad." The money, which so many people believed would solve everything, had become part of the justification for delay. From the outside, it looked logical. If funds existed, then why the urgency? Why the rush to reunify? Why not take time to do it right? But that logic ignored one fundamental truth. The family was already doing life together. Imperfectly, yes. But together. Now they were being told they needed to prove they deserved that again. BJ felt the shift sharply. She noticed how conversations changed tone. "They stopped talking to us like family," she said. "They talked like we were a case study." Every interaction felt transactional. Every visit felt like an evaluation. Even kindness began to feel conditional. Supporters who once cheered loudly grew impatient. They wanted progress. Updates. Closure. Why aren't they reunited yet? What's taking so long? If there's money, why can't they fix everything? Each question carried an accusation beneath it. Betty internalized more of it than she should have. She replayed conversations in her head late at night, wondering what she'd said wrong, what she should have done differently. I kept thinking maybe if I explained it better, she said. Maybe if I just said the right thing. But the problem wasn't her explanation. It was the framework. The system doesn't handle sudden visibility well. Especially when poverty is involved. Especially when disability is involved. Especially when money enters the picture without structure. The family was now being evaluated against standards that didn't account for who they were or how they'd survived for decades. Larry saw the contradiction clearly. They say the money proves we had help, he said. But they don't let us use it. That contradiction sat at the center of everything. Online, theories grew darker. Some claimed the family had been manipulated for profit. Others claimed they were being protected from themselves. Some insisted the separation was overdue. Others insisted it was criminal. The truth was quieter and far less satisfying. The situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The people who initially raised funds weren't equipped to manage long-term care. The agencies weren't built to handle viral charity cases. The internet wasn't interested in patience. And the family was stuck in the middle. BJ tried to speak out, but every word was scrutinized. If she sounded angry, she was labeled aggressive. If she sounded calm, she was accused of hiding something. You can't win, she said. They already decided who we are. Betty withdrew more as the months passed. She stopped watching videos. Stopped reading comments. Stopped asking questions she knew wouldn't be answered. I just pray, she said. That's all I got left. Prayer didn't bring answers, but it gave her something the system couldn't: dignity. The money, by contrast, had stripped much of that away. What began as generosity evolved into entitlement. Some donors felt ownership over outcomes. They expected transparency on their terms, timelines on their schedule, results that matched their expectations. But the family never agreed to that contract. They didn't donate to us, Larry said bluntly. They donated to an idea. And when the reality didn't match the idea, frustration turned into blame. The separation deepened that frustration. People wanted someone to fault, someone to hold accountable. So they turned inward toward the family. Why didn't you say no? Why didn't you plan better? Why didn't you protect yourselves? Questions that ignore power imbalance. Questions that assume agency where there was none. Betty didn't choose fame. She didn't choose scrutiny. She didn't choose to have strangers debate her worth as a mother, a sister, a caregiver. She chose survival. Every day of her life. And survival doesn't look neat on camera. As months passed, the $153,000 became less about helping and more about justification. A reason to pause. A reason to delay. A reason to keep the family in limbo while procedures dragged on. It feels like punishment, BJ said, for being poor and visible at the same time. The family wasn't allowed to move forward, but they couldn't go back either. That's the space they were trapped in. Not saved. Not supported. Just suspended. The public slowly moved on. New stories emerged. New causes replaced old outrage. But for the Whittakers, the consequences didn't fade with attention. They woke up every day to the same unanswered questions. They went to bed every night with the same ache. And the money that was supposed to change everything sat somewhere else, untouched, unresolved, heavy with implication. This is the part of the story people don't like to hear. Because it forces a reckoning. Not with villains. Not with heroes. But with ourselves. If you're still here, still reading, still questioning, ask yourself this. When we give, are we helping people live better lives, or are we asking them to live better stories for us? Your thoughts matter. Share them below and stay with the story. By the time the story reached its final stretch, there was no explosion left to witness. No scandal waiting to break. No dramatic reveal hiding behind one more phone call or leaked message. What remained was quieter, heavier, and far harder to undo. What remained was the damage. The number everyone kept repeating, $153,000, no longer sounded like money. It sounded like an accusation. It hovered over every conversation, every argument, every theory, like a shadow that never quite took shape. People spoke it with anger, disbelief, and certainty, even though no one could point to a moment where that number changed the Whittaker family's daily reality. For Betty, that number meant nothing tangible. "I never held it," she said once. "I never spent it. I never saw it." To her, it existed only as something people argued about online while her real life continued to shrink. What the family lost wasn't sudden. It didn't happen the day donations poured in or the day agencies stepped in. It happened slowly, through pauses that grew longer and decisions that never arrived. First, it was the waiting. Waiting for clarification. Waiting for visits. Waiting for answers that always seemed just one meeting away. Waiting became the family's new routine. Larry felt it in the silences. Conversations that once ended with "when" began ending with "if." Phone calls stopped returning. Language shifted. Words like temporary quietly disappeared, replaced by long-term planning. That was when the truth became unavoidable. Reunification was no longer being treated as the default outcome. It had become an option, one that required justification. And justification, in systems built on liability, is hard to earn. The family was no longer seen as people navigating hardship. They were seen as a risk profile. A risk to agencies. A risk to programs. A risk to reputations. Visibility had changed everything. When the Whittakers lived quietly, their poverty was tolerated. Once their lives became public, their struggles became unacceptable, not because they were worse, but because they were visible. Visibility invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites fear. Fear invites control. That control did not look like cruelty. It looked like procedure. Forms. Assessments. Evaluations. Delays. Each one justified on paper. Each one devastating in practice. Betty felt herself disappearing behind paperwork. "They talk about me like I ain't in the room," she said. "Like I'm a situation, not a person." Her days became smaller. She stopped cooking full meals. She stopped setting extra places at the table. She stopped asking when everyone was coming home. Not because she didn't care, but because hope had become painful. Timmy felt the loss differently. For him, time moved strangely. Days blurred. Promises lost their meaning when no one could explain why they changed. "They say soon," he said once. But soon never comes. Lorraine adapted in silence. She learned new routines without ever being asked if she wanted them. Adaptation looked like acceptance to outsiders. Inside, it felt like resignation. Ray missed the porch. Not just the space, but the rhythm. The sounds. The way time used to pass without being measured by check-ins and reports. They were all still alive. Still breathing. Still existing. But the family, as it had been, no longer existed in one place. The cruel irony was that the money, meant to help, had changed the rules around them entirely. Before the donations, the family's life was understood in context. After the donations, every hardship was questioned. Why hasn't this been fixed? Why hasn't that improved? Where did the money go? The assumption was simple and devastating. If money existed, suffering should disappear. But poverty doesn't work that way. Money does not erase trauma. Money does not replace systems. Money does not undo decades of survival patterns overnight. And money that never reaches the people it's raised for does nothing at all. The family became trapped between narratives. One narrative said they had been saved. Another said they had been exploited. A third said they were incapable of managing help. None of those narratives belonged to them. Betty noticed how people stopped asking what she wanted. "They tell me what's best," she said. "But they don't ask me." That loss of agency hurt more than the separation itself. Agency is the first thing poverty takes. Visibility finished the job. The online world moved on faster than the family could. Outrage burned hot and then cooled. Creators found new stories. Audiences found new causes. The Whittakers stayed where they were, living with consequences long after attention faded. That's the part most people don't see. When charity goes wrong, donors get disappointed. When systems fail, agencies issue statements. When stories end online, audiences scroll away. But families stay. They live with the aftermath. Larry described it simply. Everybody got to leave but us. There was no final accounting of the money that satisfied everyone. No resolution that erased suspicion. No moment where the truth landed cleanly and ended debate. Because the real loss was never just financial. The family lost control over their lives. They lost privacy. They lost the right to make mistakes without consequences multiplied by public judgment. They lost the ability to be poor quietly. And perhaps most devastating of all, they lost each other. Not through death. Not through choice. But through process. Process that moved slowly enough to feel neutral, but firmly enough to be final. The system didn't need to say, no. It just needed to keep saying, not yet. As weeks turned into months, hope changed shape. It became cautious, conditional, fragile. Betty still believed in reunification, but she stopped speaking about it out loud. "I think it," she said. "I just don't say it no more." Saying it made the disappointment sharper. The number $153,000 continued to circulate online, detached from the family entirely. People debated ethics. People demanded accountability. People picked sides. Meanwhile, the Whittakers learned how to live in pieces. The final lesson of this story is not that generosity is bad. It's that generosity without listening can be dangerous. It's that help imposed without consent can destabilize lives. It's that systems built to manage risk often sacrifice humanity to do it. And it's that once a vulnerable family becomes a public spectacle, returning them to ordinary life becomes almost impossible. Ordinary life requires forgiveness. It requires flexibility. It requires the freedom to fail without punishment. The Whittakers were denied all three. They became symbols instead of people. Cases instead of kin. Content instead of a family. No amount of money can undo that. If there is blame to be placed, it does not rest neatly on one person. It lives in the spaces between good intentions and real-world consequences. Between attention and responsibility. Between charity and control. The Whittaker family didn't lose everything because they were irresponsible. They lost everything because the world tried to save them louder than it tried to understand them. And when understanding is missing, even help can become harm. This is not a story with a clean ending. It is a warning. It is a reckoning. It is an invitation to do better. If you've followed this story, ask yourself one question before moving on. Did the people at the center ever truly have a choice? And if not, what does help really mean? Leave your thoughts, questions, and reflections in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.